Close your eyes and take a deep breath. You are home now, and the world outside can wait. Welcome to another episode of Z in History. In the height of the Peloponnesian War, one name sparked more passion, jealousy, and gossip than any other: Alcibiades. Blessed with a face that could stop a crowd and a mind sharp enough to outmaneuver kings, he was the ultimate prize of Athens. But beauty is a fickle currency, and as the city finds itself gripped by conflict, Alcibiades discovers that being loved by everyone is often just as dangerous as being hated. Amidst shifting loyalties, secret romances, and the weight of a crumbling marriage to the steadfast hypocrite, he must decide if he wants to be a hero of the people or the master of his own chaotic destiny. Chapter 1: The Golden Boy of Athens. The air in the banquet hall was thick with the scent of roasted lamb and expensive wine. But the chatter died down the moment Alcibiades stepped through the heavy oak doors. He didn't just enter a room, he commanded it. Even in a city that valued physical perfection, he was an anomaly. His hair was the color of polished bronze, and he moved with a casual grace that made the most seasoned soldiers feel clumsy. He leaned against a marble pillar, offering a lazy, lopsided smile to a group of starstruck young aristocrats who were already competing for his attention. Across the room, Hypparete watched him with a mixture of affection and quiet exhaustion. She had known him since they were children, back when his beauty was just a promise rather than a political tool. As he approached her, his eyes bright with the thrill of the crowd, she adjusted his cloak with a firm hand. She told him that his vanity would eventually catch up to him, but he only laughed, catching her hand in his. He whispered that the people didn't just want a leader. They wanted something beautiful to look at while the world burned. The evening was a blur of toasts and flattery, yet a shadow lingered in the corners of the hall. Not everyone was charmed. A few older senators watched from the balcony, their faces etched with disapproval. They saw a man who was too popular and too reckless. One of them shifted his weight, muttering that a man who loved his own reflection this much could never truly love his city. Alcibiades caught the man's gaze and raised his cup in a silent, mocking toast. He knew he was the most powerful man in the room, but as the flute music drifted into the night, he felt a strange, restless itch. Being the center of the world was starting to feel like a very small stage. Chapter 2: A Lesson in Patience. The morning sun hit the stone steps of the porch where Socrates sat, looking exactly like a man who didn't care about his appearance. Alcibiades paced back and forth in front of him, his fine linen tunic trailing in the dust. He was complaining about the latest session in the assembly, annoyed that the older men wouldn't listen to his grand ideas for the navy. He expected his teacher to agree, to tell him that the city was lucky to have him. Instead, Socrates simply asked him if he knew the difference between being admired and being useful. Alcibiades stopped pacing, a flash of genuine irritation crossing his face. He argued that his beauty was a gift from the gods, a sign that he was meant for greatness. Socrates let out a dry, wheezing laugh and told him that a peacock was beautiful too, but it was useless in a storm. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Alcibiades wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a man who wore the same ragged cloak every day. He wanted to storm off, but there was something in the older man's calm gaze that held him there for the first time. The golden boy felt a crack in his confidence. He sat down on the dusty step, the silence of the morning stretching between them. He confessed that he felt like he was running out of time, even though he was young. He wanted his name to be carved into the stone of history, not just whispered in the taverns. Socrates leaned in, his voice softening. He told the young man that true power came from the soul, not the face, and that if he didn't learn to lead himself, he would eventually lead Athens into ruin. Alcibiades nodded slowly, though his mind was already drifting toward the upcoming elections. Chapter 3: The Marriage Pact. The wedding between Alcibiades and Hippolyte was the social event of the decade, a union of wealth, beauty, and old family names. But as they sat together at the head of the long table, the silence between them was louder than the music. Hippolyte looked stunning in her embroidered veil, yet her eyes were focused on the flickering torchlight rather than her new husband. She knew this marriage was a political bridge, a way to anchor Alcibiades' wild reputation to a stable, respected household. She reached out and touched his arm, asking him if he could truly be content with a quiet life. Alcibiades didn't answer immediately. He was busy scanning the crowd, looking for the influential generals he needed to win over for his Sicilian expedition. He finally looked at her, his expression softening for a brief second. He promised her that he would make her the most envied woman in Greece, that their house would be filled with the spoils of his victories. Hippolyte pulled her hand back slightly. She told him she didn't want spoils. She wanted a husband who came home at night. She saw the ambition burning in his eyes like a fever, and she realized that she was married to a man who belonged to the city, not to her. By the time the last guest had stumbled home, the tension in the house was thick enough to feel. Alcibiades spent the late hours in his study, poring over maps of the Mediterranean by candlelight. Hippolyte stood in the doorway, watching the way the light caught the sharp lines of his jaw. He looked like a hero from a myth, but she felt a cold shiver of dread. He was already planning his departure, his heart already miles away on a battlefield he hadn't even reached yet. He looked up and smiled at her, but for the first time the charm felt like a mask he was forgetting to put on straight. Chapter 4: The Night of the Statues. The city was buzzing with the nervous energy of a departing army. Thousands of soldiers were preparing to sail for Sicily, and Alcibiades was at the center of it all, his armor gleaming like a second sun. But on the very morning the fleet was set to leave, Athens woke up to a nightmare. Across the city, the sacred stone statues of Hermes had been vandalized, their faces smashed and broken. The people were horrified, seeing it as a terrible omen from the gods. In the markets and the squares, a name began to circulate in hushed, angry tones: Alcibiades. His rivals had been waiting for a moment like this. They whispered that the golden boy had grown too arrogant, that he had spent the night in a drunken haze, mocking the gods with his wealthy friends. Alcibiades was stunned when the accusations reached him. He stood in the middle of his courtyard, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, while Hippolyte looked on with wide, terrified eyes. He laughed at the charges, calling them a pathetic joke, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. He realized that his beauty and popularity had finally turned into a target. He demanded an immediate trial, wanting to clear his name before the ships left the harbor. He knew that if he sailed with this shadow hanging over him, his enemies would dismantle his reputation while he was at sea. but the assembly, swayed by his opponents, refused. They told him to lead the army first and face the charges later. As he walked toward the docks, the cheers of the crowd felt hollow. He looked back at the city one last time, seeing the broken statues in his mind. The man who was once the darling of Athens was now sailing away from a trap that was already beginning to close. Chapter 5: A Choice of Exile. The journey to Sicily was plagued by doubt. Every time a messenger ship appeared on the horizon, the soldiers whispered that it was coming to arrest their commander. Finally, the order arrived. Alcibiades was to return to Athens to stand trial for impiety. He knew what that meant. In the current mood of the city, there would be no fair hearing, only a quick walk to the executioner. He sat in his cabin, the golden light of the setting sun hitting the maps he had spent months studying. He had a choice: face a rigged death, or become the very thing he hated. In the dead of night, Alcibiades slipped away from the Athenian fleet. He didn't head back to the marble pillars of his home. Instead, he steered his small boat toward the rugged, harsh coast of Sparta. To join the Spartans was the ultimate betrayal, the act of a man who had truly lost everything. When he finally stood before the Spartan elders, he looked nothing like the pampered aristocrat they expected. His clothes were salt-stained and torn, and his face was set in a mask of grim determination. He told them he knew all of Athens' secrets, and he was willing to share them. The Spartans were skeptical. They watched this beautiful, silver-tongued stranger with deep suspicion. They lived lives of iron and discipline, while he was a creature of silk and poetry. But Alcibiades began to speak, his voice weaving a spell of logic and military insight. He told them exactly how to defeat the Athenian navy and how to starve his former home into submission. As he spoke, he saw the tension in their shoulders relax. He had found a new audience, and though his heart ached at the thought of Hipparete left behind in a city he was now destroying, he knew he had to survive. Chapter 6: Winning over the King. To the surprise of everyone, Alcibiades didn't just survive in Sparta, he thrived. He cut his long bronze hair, traded his fine linen for a rough wool cloak, and began eating the infamous black broth that the Spartans called a meal. He exercised until his muscles were as hard as the local stone, proving he could be just as tough as any soldier born in the Peloponnese. King Agis of Sparta watched him with a wary respect. The king had never seen a man adapt so quickly, but he still kept his guards close whenever the Athenian was near. The real danger, however, wasn't on the training grounds. It was in the quiet hallways of the royal palace. Queen Timea was fascinated by the newcomer. She had spent her life surrounded by stoic, silent men, and Alcibiades was a revelation. He spoke of the world beyond the mountains, of art and philosophy, and he looked at her with a gaze that made her feel like the center of a forgotten myth. They began to meet in the gardens, their conversations lingering longer than they should. Alcibiades knew he was playing a deadly game, but the thrill of the risk was the only thing that made him feel alive. One evening, as the moon rose over the jagged peaks of the Tagitus Mountains, Timea asked him if he ever regretted leaving Athens. He looked at her, his face softening in the shadows. He admitted that he missed the smell of the sea and the sound of the assembly, but he told her that home wasn't a place. It was the feeling of being understood. It was a lie, or perhaps only half a truth, but it worked. The queen leaned closer, and in that moment, the political exile and the lonely queen formed a bond that would soon threaten to burn Sparta to the ground. Chapter 7: The Secret Departure. The atmosphere in Sparta shifted from cool suspicion to a deadly chill. King Agis returned from a long campaign to find whispers throughout his court about the Athenian guest and the queen. Rumors of a child with bronze hair and Athenian eyes began to circulate, and the king's respect for Alcibiades curdled into a silent, murderous rage. Alcibiades, always sensitive to the moods of powerful men, noticed the way the guards tightened their grip on their spears when he passed. He knew the clock had run out on his Spartan welcome. He didn't wait for a formal execution order. Under the cover of a moonless night, he slipped out of the city, leaving behind his rough wool cloak and the queen who had risked everything for him. As he rode toward the coast, he felt a familiar pang of loneliness. He was a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere, a ghost moving between the gears of history. He reached the sea just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, and he turned his eyes toward the east. His next move was a gamble that would have terrified any other man. But for Alcibiades, it was simply another Tuesday. Chapter 8: The Persian Silk. In the satrapy of Sardis, Alcibiades traded his Spartan grit for Persian silk. He reinvented himself yet again, this time as a polished diplomat draped in gold and perfumes. He became the closest advisor to Tissaphernes, the powerful Persian governor. While lounging on embroidered cushions and dining on exotic fruits, Alcibiades began to weave a complex web. He played the Persians against the Spartans and the Spartans against the Athenians, making sure no side gained too much power. He was the puppet master of the Mediterranean, and he loved every second of the chaos. Despite the luxury, a deep sense of homesickness began to gnaw at him. He spent his evenings looking west, toward the Aegean Sea. He started sending secret letters to the Athenian generals stationed at Samos, hinting that he could bring Persian gold to their side if they would only allow him to return. He knew the city was in turmoil, struggling with the war he had helped escalate. He positioned himself as the only man who could save Athens from the very fire he had helped light. It was a bold, arrogant move, but it was exactly the kind of drama the Athenian people couldn't resist. Chapter 9: The Fleet Returns. The Athenian navy finally sent word they wanted him back, not as a prisoner, but as a commander. When Alcibiades arrived at the camp at Samos, the soldiers cheered until their throats were raw. To them, he wasn't a traitor. He was a legend, a golden talisman who brought victory with him. He stepped off his ship with his head held high, his bronze hair catching the light, as if the years of exile had never happened. However, the reunion with his old life was complicated. He had to face the men he had betrayed and the city he had nearly destroyed back in Athens. Hippolyte heard the news of his return with a heavy heart. She had lived through the scandal, the disgrace, and the long years of silence. She had rebuilt her life in the shadows, and now the man who had caused it all was returning as a hero. When he finally walked through the doors of their home, he looked older, with fine lines around his eyes, but his smile was just as devastating as the day they wed. He reached out to her, but she stayed back, asking him if he was home to stay, or if this was just another stop on his tour of the world. Chapter 10: The Last Great Victory. The waters near Cyzicus were calm, but the tension on the Athenian decks was electric. Alcibiades stood at the prow of his flagship, his eyes scanning the horizon for the Spartan fleet. He had devised a daring plan, using himself as bait to lure the enemy into a trap. As the Spartan ships gave chase, thinking they had the legendary rebel cornered, the rest of the Athenian navy swarmed from behind the cliffs. It was a masterclass in naval strategy, a whirlwind of crashing wood and bronze-tipped oars that left the Spartan fleet in ruins. When the news reached Athens, the city erupted in joy. The man who had been their greatest villain was now their undisputed savior. Alcibiades returned to the city's harbor in a ship decorated with captured shields, looking like a god descending from Olympus. For a few glorious weeks, the past was forgotten. He walked the streets through a rain of flower petals, and even his fiercest critics stayed silent. He spent a quiet evening with Hipparete, showing her the golden crown the city had given him, but she only looked at his hands, wondering how much blood it had cost to polish the gold. Chapter 11. The Shadow of Doubt. The honeymoon with Athens didn't last. While Alcibiades was away on a minor scouting mission, his second-in-command engaged the Spartans against orders and suffered a stinging defeat. It was a small loss in the grand scheme of the war, but in the volatile climate of Athenian politics, it was enough to spark a fire. His enemies, who had been hiding in the shadows, pounced on the opportunity. They claimed he was growing lazy, or worse, that he was still secretly working for the Persians. The love of the people, which had felt so solid, turned to ice overnight. Alcibiades watched from the coast as the assembly voted to strip him of his command once again. He didn't wait for the soldiers to come for him this time. He felt a profound sense of weariness, a realization that he was trapped in a cycle he could never break. He met Hipparete one last time near the city gates. He asked her to come with him to a small estate he owned in the north, away from the wars and the whispers. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and shook her head. She told him that he was a man of the storm, and she could only live in the sun. He turned away, disappearing into the morning mist alone. Chapter 12. The Final Sunset. Years later, Alcibiades lived in a small, fortified villa in Phrygia. He was no longer the commander of fleets, but he still dressed in fine silks, maintaining the image of the man he used to be. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he sat on his terrace, watching the shadows grow long. He knew his enemies had finally found him. A group of men, sent by his rivals, surrounded the house and set the wooden beams on fire. There was no escape, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning cedar. He didn't hide. He wrapped his cloak around his left arm to act as a shield, and gripped his dagger in his right. He burst through the flames and into the courtyard, looking so fierce and beautiful even in the face of death that the assassins momentarily froze. He went down not by the sword, but by a rain of arrows from a distance, because no man dared to face him up close. As he lay on the ground, the last thing he saw was the vast golden sky. He died as he lived at the center of the world's gaze, a legend of beauty, brilliance, and a life lived entirely on his own terms.